Usually when we look at a map of the world, there's this expectation of precision. We treat it almost like an engineering schematic, right? Or like a medical X-ray.
Right, yeah. You see the clean, distinct borders.
Exactly. The solid colors separating one nation from another, the capital cities neatly marked with little stars. It feels organized. And it gives you this very comforting illusion that global politics operates with that same clear binary logic.
Like the good guys are in blue, the bad guys are in red.
Yeah, the lines are drawn.
It's a very seductive way to view the world, honestly. It's like looking at a broken bone on an X-ray. You point to the fracture and say, there is the problem, and here is the cast we need to put on it. We desperately want international relations to be visible, categorized, and easily solvable.
But then you step away from the map and into the actual real-world landscape of modern geopolitics, specifically the Middle East and American foreign policy, and suddenly that X-ray machine is it's completely broken. We aren't looking at clean lines anymore. We are looking at a geopolitical landscape that is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And if you're trying to figure out what's actually happening beneath the surface, you have to be willing to listen to voices that challenge the entire fundamental premise of that map.
Which is exactly what we're doing today.
That's right. Because today, we're jumping into the geopolitical mud with Colonel Douglas Macgregor.
Yes, we are.
We're unpacking a highly provocative, deeply critical interview he recently gave regarding the state of the world. He's a man who takes that neat, color-coded map we all grew up with and essentially sets it on fire.
He really does.
We're going to be exploring his incredibly controversial takes on Donald Trump's foreign policy, the looming threat of a broader Middle Eastern conflict, the incredibly precarious state of the global economy, and this massive seismic shift toward a multipolar world.
And, if you're listening to this and already feeling your blood pressure rise, it's important to set a baseline for our discussion today.
Yeah.
Macgregor presents viewpoints that are highly intentionally politically charged. He issues sweeping, uncompromising critiques of both the U.S. Republican and Democratic parties, mainstream media narratives, and a whole host of international actors.
Right.
So our role here isn't to endorse these views or to take a side. We are treating his claims as a framework. We want to deconstruct his specific arguments, look at the historical precedents he cites, and really understand the architecture of his perspective. Because to understand the massive shifts happening in global discourse right now, you really have to understand the arguments being made by the system's most vocal critics.
Absolutely. And to understand Macgregor's foreign policy views, you first have to understand his baseline worldview. Right? It doesn't start with military doctrine. It stems from a profound, almost ancestral skepticism of state authority.
Yeah, it's baked into him.
There is this anecdote he shares in the source material that I think perfectly encapsulates this, and it has absolutely nothing to do with bombs or treaties. It takes us back to 1978.
Oh, the Sweden story.
Yes. Macgregor is a young man visiting Sweden for the first time. He's sitting in the back of a car, and he hasn't put his seatbelt on. The driver turns around and tells him he has to wear it. And Macgregor simply asks, why?
It's the most basic question, right?
Yeah.
But the response he gets is what really sets him off.
The driver says, well, the state has said that you must wear a seatbelt. And Macgregor, citing his Scottish and Celtic ancestry, basically scoffs at them. He says, to hell with the state. I don't even like the state.
Which is just a wild thing to say to a Swedish host in the 70s.
Completely. The Swedish hosts are totally baffled. They try to explain that the state did extensive public health studies and determined that wearing a seatbelt was good for him. But to Macgregor, that phrase, the state has determined this is good for you, is like waving a red flag in front of a bull.
He hates it.
He refuses. He only eventually puts it on when they plead with him that they might get in trouble with the local police.
It's a highly revealing detail. And what's critical here is that he connects that exact same inherent visceral distrust of government overreach to his personal choices decades later.
Right, with COVID.
Exactly. He cites this same mentality when explaining his refusal to get vaccinated during the COVID-19 pandemic, a state mandate which he dismisses entirely as nonsense. What is fascinating is the psychological profile this builds. Think about it. Here is a man who spent his entire career in the United States military.
Which is arguably the ultimate, most rigid state institution on the planet.
Right. Yet underneath the uniform, he harbors this deep-seated rebellion against state intrusion into private life.
So if you were listening to this and wondering, why does the story about a Swedish seatbelt from 1978 matter when we're trying to analyze a potential war in the Middle East? It's
Mhm.
because it forms the lens through which he views all intelligence.
Precisely. If you distrust the state's narratives at home, if your default assumption is that the government is overreaching, manipulating data, or flat out lying when it tells you what is best for your health or your daily safety, you're inevitably going to apply that exact same skeptical lens to foreign policy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In Macgregor's view, all mainstream government narratives, whether they originate in Washington, London, or Berlin, are inherently suspect. He believes that populations, particularly in Germanic countries and increasingly in Great Britain and the U.S., have been conditioned to mindlessly believe whatever narrative is pumped through the evening news.
He sees this blind faith in government not just as naive, but as a fatal flaw, right? One that is going to backfire enormously on Western civilization.
Exactly.
He's basically operating on the principle that if they lie to you about the small things, they are absolutely lying to you about the massive things. And that foundational distrust leads us directly into his assessment of the current U.S. administration's geopolitical predicament, specifically looking at Donald Trump. Macgregor argues that Trump's foreign policy isn't actually being driven by some grand 3D chess strategic national interest. He argues that Trump is, to use his exact word, trapped.
Trapped in a vicious escalatory cycle, primarily with Iran. And Macgregor breaks this down by looking at the specific language Trump uses. I mean, we're all familiar with Trump's reliance on extreme hyperbole.
Yeah. Threatening to destroy a civilization overnight or unleash fire and fury.
Right. And a lot of mainstream analysts try to frame this as the madman theory of diplomacy, like it's a calculated attempt to make enemies think he's unhinged so they back down.
But Macgregor dismisses that entirely, doesn't he?
He does. He frames this rhetoric purely as a holdover from Trump's days in the New York real estate market.
It's the business mindset applied to international diplomacy, but in the most dangerous way possible. Macgregor specifically points out that Trump declared bankruptcy 6 times in his corporate career. Now, for anyone outside the U.S., our Chapter 11 bankruptcy code allows a business to essentially hit the pause button. You freeze your debts, you restructure your organization, and you keep operating. It's a strategic retreat.
Yeah, in the cutthroat world of New York real estate, bankruptcy isn't a fatal flaw.
Not at all. It's just a tactic. It's a business model. You make crazy threats, you posture, you look incredibly tough, and if it all goes wrong, you just file Chapter 11, wipe the slate clean, and start over.
But the translation error here, according to Macgregor, is catastrophic, because you cannot file Chapter 11 on a nuclear escalation.
No, you really can't.
You can't hit the pause button and restructure after a ballistic missile exchange. Macgregor argues that Trump doesn't truly grasp the gravity of using that kind of apocalyptic language on the world stage. When you threaten to wipe an entire civilization off the map, international actors, especially those who have spent decades preparing for existential defense, do not read that as a negotiation tactic.
They read that as a literal readiness to use nuclear weapons.
It's exactly. Macgregor claims Trump just wants the domestic optics of having done something bold and decisive without understanding the kinetic mechanics of what he is actually threatening.
It's like, imagine you're sitting at a table playing a high-stakes game of Texas Hold'em, right? But you treat it like a loud, chaotic real estate negotiation.
Okay.
You keep screaming at the other players that you're going to flip the table, burn the casino to the ground, and ruin their families if you don't win the hand. In real estate, the other guy might give you a slight discount just to get you out of his office.
Right, just to make you go away.
But at this poker table, the other players actually have matches, they are soaked in gasoline, and they take every single one of your threats literally.
That's a terrifying analogy, but it fits his argument perfectly.
Yeah.
And because of this environment of extreme rhetoric and bad faith, Macgregor dismisses the United States' ongoing diplomatic efforts almost entirely. He views them as empty theater.
Yeah, he brings up a recent peace summit held in Islamabad, Pakistan, right, which was touted as a major diplomatic step.
And Macgregor just waves it away as completely meaningless.
And he gives a very specific, deeply cynical reason why. He points to the actual human beings the U.S. sends to these regions to negotiate. He specifically names Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff.
Right.
According to Macgregor, these individuals are not viewed across the Middle East as neutral, good-faith American diplomats. They are viewed effectively as Israeli agents.
And furthermore, he claims they suffer from a massive credibility deficit because regional leaders view them as individuals primarily interested in organizing personal side deals to enrich themselves, rather than securing lasting peace.
Wow.
Yeah. And he is careful to note that this isn't just a critique of the Trump administration's personnel. He points out that former Secretary of State Antony Blinken under the Biden administration suffered from the exact same perception in the Middle East. Blinken, too, was seen not as a broker for American strategic interests, but as a representative for the State of Israel's interests.
So if we follow Macgregor's logic, the U.S. is operating with a massive handicap. We don't tell the truth, our leader threatens to annihilate people while allegedly trying to negotiate, and our envoys are viewed as compromised before they even sit down at the table.
Exactly.
But here's where we get into the actual mechanics of the trap. Macgregor says Trump is caught in domestically. We have this image of Trump acting crazy for the sake of optics, but Macgregor outlines a very real, very sobering conflict of interest.
It's the collision between economic reality and political funding. On one hand, for Trump to survive politically with his voter base, especially with midterm elections always looming on the horizon, he desperately needs a stable domestic economy.
Right. He needs low gas prices at the pump. He needs inflation to cool down.
Yes, because if a hot war breaks out in the Persian Gulf and global oil prices skyrocket, the cost of living for the average American is going to surge and his political prospects will evaporate. The voters will punish him.
But on the other hand, Macgregor claims Trump is totally beholden to the people who fund his campaigns. And Macgregor uses very specific, highly charged language here. He calls these major campaign backers Zionist billionaires who, in his words, effectively bought the White House for him.
Macgregor alleges that the unspoken, or perhaps spoken deal struck before Trump was elected, was that in exchange for the massive financial backing required to win the White House, Trump would eventually settle matters with Iran.
That conflict was the price of his presidency.
According to Macgregor, yes.
So this is the Socratic question we have to ask ourselves when looking at this framework. If we take this real estate bankruptcy mindset and apply it to geopolitics, is it possible that Trump's optics-driven strategy is actually a highly calculated, albeit risky, move?
Like a massive bluff?
Yeah. Is he trying to satisfy these mega donors with incredibly tough talk and performative aggression, hoping he can delay actually starting a war that would ruin the economy? Or is it purely an inescapable trap, as Macgregor claims?
Macgregor's analysis strongly leans toward it being an inescapable trap. He argues that when a leader's domestic political survival, which relies on keeping the donor class happy conflicts directly and immovably with their domestic economic survival, which relies on keeping voters insulated from inflation, traditional diplomacy ceases to exist.
It just becomes an elaborate theatrical production designed to mask the trap.
Precisely. Trump cannot afford the catastrophic economic fallout of a war, but he simultaneously cannot afford to alienate the billionaire donors who are demanding one.
So he just keeps turning up the volume on the rhetoric, hoping something gives before the dam breaks. But if Trump is trapped by these donor interests pushing relentlessly for conflict, we have to ask, what is the ultimate goal?
Right, why the push?
If war is the desired outcome for this donor class, why? Why the intense singular focus on Iran? And this brings us to an incredibly controversial concept Macgregor introduces, which fundamentally redefines the stated goals of U.S. foreign policy in the region.
He points directly to what he refers to as the Greater Israel Project.
Let's establish the baseline of his argument here, because it directly contradicts everything you hear on the nightly news. Macgregor flatly, emphatically asserts that the current escalating conflict in the Middle East is absolutely not about Iran posing an existential threat to the United States.
No. He states repeatedly that Iran absolutely does not pose a threat to the U.S., and frankly, never has.
Instead, his framework posits that the hostility defining the last 40-plus years is entirely driven by Israel's determination to destroy Iran. And this is where he details the immense territorial and supremacist ambitions that he attributes to this Greater Israel Project.
And we need to be really specific about what he claims this project actually entails, because the geographical scope he describes is staggering. He says this is not a border dispute over a few miles of desert.
Not at all.
He claims this project aims to eventually control half of Lebanon, half of Syria, the top 30% of Saudi Arabia, the entirety of Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula, and even stretching across into part of the west bank of the Nile River in Egypt.
Wait, all the way to the Nile? That's a massive swath of territory.
It is. And he emphasizes that the ultimate goal is more than just drawing new lines on a map. He explicitly states the objective is guaranteeing Israeli Jewish supremacy throughout this newly expanded region.
Okay.
According to Macgregor, if you look at the geopolitical board, every other state in the region has essentially backed down, retreated, or quietly agreed to accommodate this reality. Iran, he argues, is the very last sovereign state in the region that categorically refuses to bow to this supremacy.
Therefore, in this specific worldview, Iran must be destroyed because it is the final, stubborn obstacle to realizing this massive project.
Exactly.
And he doesn't just blame the current administration for this. He traces the roots of this hidden U.S. policy all the way back to the 1990s. He cites influential neoconservative figures from that era, like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Perle.
Right, the architects of a lot of post-Cold War strategy.
Yeah. Macgregor argues that back in the 90s and early 2000s, the nominal framing sold to the American public was that the U.S. military needed to secure Middle Eastern oil resources to counter a rapidly rising China. But Macgregor claims that was nothing more than a convenient smokescreen.
A total fabrication in his eyes.
The reality, he argues, was always about controlling those resources and destabilizing regional powers to make Israel great.
He is systematically stripping away every single conventional narrative we have been taught to believe for decades. The narrative of spreading democracy, the narrative of fighting a global war on terror, the narrative of protecting international shipping lanes. He dismisses all of it as PR.
It's all just window dressing.
Right. He reduces the entirety of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East to serving as a heavily armed proxy force, a blunt trillion-dollar instrument for a foreign ally's regional hegemony.
I want to pause here and really challenge this because it's a monumental claim. We are asking you to look at this critically. Are we genuinely supposed to believe that the entire United States foreign policy apparatus, spanning multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, the Pentagon, and all the intelligence agencies, has been totally, completely hijacked for a territorial expansion project of a foreign ally?
It's a huge thing to swallow.
Is Macgregor deliberately ignoring the United States' own sovereign strategic interests in the region? I mean, the U.S. genuinely does have a vital interest in global energy markets and countering rival superpowers like China and Russia, don't we?
It is the necessary pushback. If you read mainstream geopolitical analysis, the absolute consensus is that the United States acts primarily in its own hegemonic interests. We want to be the unipolar power.
Right.
But Macgregor's counterargument is the theory of total capture. He is suggesting that those so-called U.S. interests have become so deeply entangled with and manipulated by the donor class he described earlier that there is no longer any daylight between what Washington's strategic goals are and what Jerusalem wants. He is suggesting that the machine has been entirely co-opted.
Okay, let's follow his logic down this path. Let's assume the machine is co-opted. If the U.S. proceeds with this proxy war, if it goes all in on the kinetic campaign to destroy Iran to satisfy these alleged donor demands, what is the actual collateral damage to the United States?
It's not just a few lost elections.
No, because according to Macgregor, it's not just a messy foreign entanglement. It is the total catastrophic collapse of American economic dominance. The war won't just be fought in the desert, it will be fought in your bank account.
This connects the military strategy directly to the precarious state of the petrodollar and the accelerating global movement of de-dollarization.
We really need to break down the mechanism of the petrodollar because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but its actual function is rarely explained in plain English.
Let's do it. Let's go back to the 1970s.
Okay, the 1970s. The U.S. goes off the gold standard. To keep the U.S. dollar valuable, the government strikes a deal with Saudi Arabia. The U.S. agrees to provide military protection for the Saudi royal family. In exchange, Saudi Arabia agrees to price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Which means that if any country on Earth, Japan, France, Brazil, wants to buy oil to run their economy, they first have to acquire U.S. dollars.
Right. They can't use their own currency.
Exactly. And this creates a massive artificial global demand for the dollar.
And because all these countries have to hold billions of U.S. dollars, they invest those dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. They are effectively lending money to the U.S. government at incredibly low interest rates. This mechanism, the petrodollar, is the gravity that holds the entire U.S. financial universe together.
It really is.
It allows the U.S. government to run massive deficits, fund a gigantic military, and maintain a high domestic standard of living without triggering hyperinflation, because the rest of the world is constantly absorbing our currency to buy oil.
But Macgregor argues that this foundational system is actively crumbling. The Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, are actively de-dollarizing.
Moving away from the dollar.
Yes. They are following a crusade that has been led for a long time by Russia and China, operating through the BRICS coalition. Macgregor points out that today, if you want to buy oil from the Persian Gulf and your nation is not explicitly associated with the United States or Israel, you are paying for that oil in Chinese yuan, Indian rupees, or Russian rubles.
So the monopoly is breaking.
The monopoly is breaking.
The foundation is already cracking. But then Macgregor outlines a catastrophic scenario if a hot war actually breaks out. Let's say the U.S. decides to initiate a bombing campaign against Iranian oil infrastructure or their critical desalination plants. Macgregor says the U.S. military planners might view that as a targeted, localized strike.
But Iran's retaliation would be devastatingly simple, and it wouldn't target the U.S. directly.
Why not?
Because the regional infrastructure is incredibly fragile. Macgregor states that Iran wouldn't even need to launch complex attacks against major, heavily defended targets like the port of Jeddah in the Red Sea. All they have to do is hit the vulnerable, exposed pipelines running across the Saudi desert and the oil processing infrastructure inside the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait.
Just the pipelines.
Yeah, he notes that much of this infrastructure is aging and in bad shape anyway. A few precise missile strikes from Iran could finish it off entirely.
To put an analogy to this, think of a global economy as a massive structural arch. The keystone, the single block at the very top center holding the pressure of the entire structure, is the physical Saudi oil pumping infrastructure.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The arch itself, the thing spanning the globe, is the petrodollar system. You don't have to dismantle the whole arch to bring it down. You just have to crack that one physical keystone with a few missiles. If the Saudi pipelines blow up, the oil stops flowing. If the oil stops flowing, the global demand for the U.S. dollar vanishes overnight.
And if the dam for the dollar vanishes, those trillions of dollars held overseas come flooding back into the U.S. economy. Inflation skyrockets to unprecedented levels. The U.S. government can no longer finance its debt cheaply. The standard of living crashes.
It would be an absolute nightmare.
The global ripple effects would be biblical. Macgregor points out that China, for example, relies on the Persian Gulf for 50% of its oil. 13% of their total inventory comes from Iran alone. The destruction of that infrastructure would halt the global economy.
Which explains why China is highly motivated to broker peace in the region. But what's really intriguing is how Macgregor views the maneuvering of other BRICS nations amidst all this tension. You might look at the international news, see Indian Prime Minister Modi warmly hugging Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and think, well, the BRICS coalition is divided. India is clearly siding with Israel.
Macgregor warns us not to attach too much geopolitical significance to a photo op hug.
Right.
Because behind the scenes, the economic reality tells a different story. India was actually one of the first nations to negotiate directly with Iran to secure passage through the Strait of Hormuz. India desperately needs the diesel, the petrochemical feedstocks for manufacturing, the fertilizers for their massive agricultural sector, and the helium required for microcircuitry that comes out of the Gulf.
And crucially, they are paying the toll to Iran for these resources in non-dollar currencies. But this leads to a massive glaring contradiction, and we really have to unpack it. If an escalating war is pure economic suicide, if it guarantees the destruction of their own oil pipelines, why would the UAE and Saudi Arabia reportedly be pushing so hard behind the scenes for the U.S. to attack Iran?
It seems counterintuitive.
Why would they support actions that will inevitably lead to their own economic lifeblood getting blown up? Are their leaders completely blind to the risks?
Macgregor has a very blunt historical answer for that. He argues that these states, from Jordan all the way down the coast to the Emirates, are essentially artificial constructs.
Artificial constructs.
Yes. He notes they are not ancient nations with deep, organic, strategic cultures. They are products of British and French imperialism following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. He recounts the famous historical anecdote of Winston Churchill literally sitting down with a map and drawing the borders of Jordan in a single afternoon.
Literally just drawing lines on a piece of paper.
Right. And because they are artificial, Macgregor implies they fundamentally lack long-term organic strategic vision. They are relying on U.S. protection rather than seeing the geopolitical board clearly.
So they don't see the keystone cracking. But to connect the dots for our broader discussion, Macgregor is illustrating that the era of the unipolar U.S. economy, guaranteed by military might, is ending.
It is over, in his view.
Historically, the U.S. economy relied on controlling the Persian Gulf. After the British Empire retreated from the region, the U.S. stepped in to fill the vacuum. We tried to use the Shah of Iran as a proxy to control the region for Western banking systems, and when the 1979 revolution happened, that failed. Today, Macgregor asserts a simple, deeply unpalatable reality for Washington. Iran controls the Gulf.
And the U.S. establishment simply refuses to accept this reality. We refuse to treat Iran as a legitimate status quo actor with geographic rights in its own backyard. We treat them, as Macgregor says, like a semi-Bolshevik state bent on conquering the world, which he argues is a complete mischaracterization.
Right, and he compares what we should do to the Montreux Convention. For those who don't know, after World War I, the international community realized Turkey physically controlled the vital Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits. Instead of fighting endless wars over it, they signed the Montreux Convention in 1936.
They established clear rules.
Exactly. Turkey controls the straits, warships have tonnage limits, and everyone has to give notice. It acknowledged geographic reality, and it largely worked.
But Macgregor points out that the U.S. refuses to adopt a Montreux-style reality check for Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. We insist on maintaining total unilateral dominance over a region halfway across the world, a dominance we can no longer actually enforce.
Which brings us to a terrifying question. If a war would ruin the U.S. economy by destroying the petrodollar, and if we no longer have the total dominance required to control the region, why do U.S. military leaders seem so confident?
It's a great question.
Why do they think they can win a war with Iran quickly and cleanly? According to Macgregor, the problem isn't just political corruption or donor capture, it is deeply embedded in a fundamentally flawed military doctrine.
Yes, and he points the finger directly at the institutional mindset of the United States Air Force.
The Air Force.
Yeah, he notes that Trump is heavily influenced by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who is an Air Force general. And Macgregor claims that as an institution, the Air Force has believed since the 1920s, clinging to it as an absolute, unquestionable article of faith, that air power alone can win any conflict.
It's the idea that you don't need to hold territory. You just need an endless computerized list of targets. You don't need a massive bloody ground invasion. You don't need a Navy blockade. You just bomb infrastructure from the sky long enough, and eventually the enemy population will break and surrender to you.
But Macgregor outright states a military truth. Air targeting is not a strategy.
Right, because what actually happens when the target list runs out?
Exactly. You've blown up every building, and the enemy still hasn't surrendered. The war doesn't just end because you're out of bombs.
To illustrate the sheer historical arrogance of this mindset, Macgregor reaches back into World War II with a chilling comparison. He compares the current U.S. military arrogance regarding Iran to Adolf Hitler, ignoring the German general staff in December 1940, right before he launched Operation Barbarossa, the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union.
It's a profound historical parallel that deserves unpacking. Let's look at what Macgregor says happened. The German general staff, the seasoned military professionals, came to Hitler and warned him that the Soviet Union was simply too massive to conquer quickly.
They saw the logistical nightmare.
They did. They pointed out there were no paved roads, very few rail lines, and brutal weather. They reminded him that half the German army had been able to successfully blitzkrieg across Western Europe because the infrastructure was so good they could literally refuel their Panzer tanks at local French and Belgian gas stations.
Right, you can't just pull a tank division up to a Shell station on the muddy steppes outside Moscow. The logistics changed completely.
Exactly. But Hitler dismissed their logistical concerns entirely. He said the Russians were weak. He pointed to their incredibly poor, disorganized performance in the Winter War against Finland as proof.
Right, the Finland War.
He believed that because Stalin had recently purged and killed tens of thousands of his own officers, the Soviet military was inherently incompetent and fragile. The generals explicitly warned him, do not underestimate the Russian soldier. But Hitler waved them off, believing superior German tactics would cause the whole rotten structure to kick in the door and collapse.
And history tells us exactly how that ended. It became the frozen meat grinder that ultimately destroyed the Third Reich. And Macgregor is saying that Trump and his military advisors, particularly when listening to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who promises that a conflict with Iran would be over quickly through violent, targeted bombing, are making the exact same fatal underestimation of Iran's immense size, its unforgiving geography, and its resilient capability.
Furthermore, Macgregor specifically attacks a core tenet of modern Western military thought, which we might call the decapitation myth.
This is a huge point. The U.S. and Israel operate on this mentality. Macgregor actually calls it a sick mentality, that if you just assassinate the top leadership, if you murder everyone currently in charge with a drone strike, the regime will instantly fracture, collapse, and you win the war by default.
But Macgregor goes back to that Stalin example to prove how historically ignorant this is. He points out that when Stalin paranoia purged and shot 50,000 Soviet officers, it didn't destroy the military's effectiveness in the long run. In many ways, it actually improved it.
How does killing your own officers improve an army?
Because the old guard, the men fighting the last war, were removed. It rapidly opened up senior command positions to much younger men who were often more energetic, more ruthless, more competent, and far better adapted to the realities of modern mechanized warfare.
Let me throw an analogy at this to really clarify why the U.S. strategy is flawed. Relying entirely on air power and targeted assassinations is like trying to win a complex, grueling game of chess, but refusing to actually touch the board or understand how the pieces move.
Okay, I like this.
Instead, you just stand across the room with a high-powered sniper rifle, trying to shoot the opponent's king from afar. You fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of the game. You might successfully hit a piece, you might even take out a bishop or a knight, but you haven't won the game. The board is still there, and now the opponent is moving their surviving rooks and pawns in ways you can't even see.
And to build on your analogy with the Stalin example, if killing an enemy's older leaders inadvertently makes their military stronger by forcing younger, more energetic commanders to take charge, isn't the U.S. military actively upgrading its enemy's command structures with every single high-profile drone strike they launch?
Wow. Think about that. Every time we take out a 65-year-old general we've been tracking and studying for 10 years, we might just be replacing him with a 35-year-old tactical genius whose methods we know absolutely nothing about.
Exactly. It highlights how institutional arrogance, combined with historical amnesia, guarantees future disasters. Macgregor's perspective here is that the U.S. is applying a World War II conventional force mindset mixed with a dangerously naive faith in sterile air power to a nation and a region that simply cannot be conquered from the sky.
Which transitions us perfectly into the realities on the ground. If the theoretical strategy of relying on air power is deeply flawed, what is the harsh kinetic reality of Iran's actual military capabilities today? Because Macgregor paints a picture of a 21st century battlefield that the U.S. military, despite its massive budget, is completely unprepared for.
He begins by defining what the U.S. military actually is designed to do. The United States is, at its core, built as a maritime and an aerospace power. It is designed to project power across oceans and skies. It is not a massive land power, except perhaps on the North American continent.
Right, our army isn't that big compared to our global footprint.
Macgregor notes the U.S. Army currently has roughly 450,000 active duty personnel. But to even begin to think seriously about a successful ground invasion and occupation of a country the size of Iran, military planners know you would require at least 1 million men.
1 million troops. We don't have the draft anymore. That number is politically and logistically impossible.
Completely impossible. And furthermore, Macgregor points out that the global geopolitical climate has changed drastically since the U.S. moved massive forces during the Gulf War in 1990.
Oh, definitely.
Back then, we leisurely moved a massive armada across the ocean over several months with zero resistance. Today, if we tried a massive, slow troop movement to the Persian Gulf, Macgregor warns that peer adversaries like Russia or China could easily intercept, harass, or even sink U.S. ships en route or shoot down our cargo planes. The invasion force might never even reach the Middle East.
And if they do somehow reach the Gulf safely, they face what Macgregor calls Iran's 21st century paradigm of warfare.
Yes.
We really need to detail this because it changes the entire physics of a potential conflict. Iran isn't planning to fight a 90s tank-on-tank desert war. They are utilizing persistent overhead surveillance.
Right, ISR.
And by ISR intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, we aren't just talking about guys with binoculars on the hill. We are talking about networked, space-based platforms, commercial satellite data, and terrestrial radar. And all of these sensory platforms are linked directly in real time to hundreds of mobile strike systems equipped with thousands of precision ballistic missiles and unmanned suicide drones.
The result of this deep integration is that Iran has successfully created a massive, highly lethal killing zone. According to Macgregor, this anti-access area denial zone extends anywhere from 600 to 1,200 kilometers out from Iran's physical borders.
1,200 kilometers. That is an immense distance.
It's massive.
And because of this killing zone, the vaunted U.S. Navy and Air Force, which are our primary multi-billion-dollar methods of projecting power, are forced to park their aircraft carriers and staging bases hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Iran. If they sail closer, they are inside the zone and vulnerable to a swarm of cheap missiles that can overcome their billion-dollar defense systems.
This geographic reality effectively neutralizes our greatest technological strengths.
Yeah.
And Macgregor points out that even our current limited bombing campaigns in the broader region are largely performative. We are dropping incredibly expensive munitions on cheap decoys. We are bombing empty stretches of sand or abandoned warehouses. The real assets, the missile manufacturing, the nuclear research, the critical command infrastructure are buried deep underground in fortified mountain bunkers.
And if you think, well, we'll just send in elite special operations forces on the ground to paint the real targets with lasers, Macgregor says that doctrine is useless now, too.
Why is that?
Because of that same persistent networked surveillance. A SEAL team or Delta Force unit will be seen by drones, tracked, and eliminated immediately. The element of surprise is completely gone.
To visualize this dynamic, imagine the U.S. military is a legendary, undefeated heavyweight boxer. We have the most devastating, earth-shattering knockout punch in the history of the world. But we have incredibly short arms. We have to be up close to land the blow.
Oh, that makes sense.
Iran, meanwhile, is a fighter with a relentless, lightning-fast, extremely long-range jab. They just keep circling the ring, jabbing us from 1,200 kilometers away, keeping the heavyweight champion completely outside the striking zone. We can swing our multi-billion-dollar fists all we want, but we are just hitting air, and eventually we're going to get exhausted.
That is exactly the tactical dilemma. The shift in asymmetric warfare over the last 2 decades is profound. Expensive traditional force projection, like a $13 billion Ford-class aircraft carrier, is being rendered increasingly obsolete by swarms of cheap network defense systems, off-the-shelf drones, and localized persistent surveillance.
But I want to pause and consider a very logical pushback here. If U.S. military technology is supposedly the most advanced, best-funded endeavor in the history of human civilization, how did a heavily sanctioned, economically isolated country like Iran managed to build an impenetrable 1,200-kilometer killing zone?
Yeah, how does that happen?
Has the massive U.S. military-industrial complex just been buying the completely wrong weapons for 30 years?
It raises a vital question about adaptation versus institutional inertia. Bureaucracies naturally want to keep building the things they already know how to build, like massive ships and fighter jets. Macgregor's analysis suggests we're trying to crack a 21st century network defense with the prestige weapons and strategic dogmas of the 20th century. And it simply won't work.
So let's look at the options. If we can't win militarily, because we literally can't get close enough without taking unacceptable losses, and we can't win economically because a war will destroy the petrodollar and collapse our own economy, what is the fallback U.S. strategy?
Well, historically, the fallback has always been regime change from within, the CIA's dream.
Right.
The hope that the local population will finally rise up, overthrow the hostile government for us, and install a pro-Western democracy. But Macgregor argues that our current kinetic actions, specifically dropping bombs on their neighbors and threatening them, are actively destroying the very people who could have facilitated that change in Iran.
This is where Macgregor completely shatters a major, deeply held Western assumption about Iranian society. He argues that American policymakers fundamentally misunderstand the internal dynamic between Iranian nationalism and the Islamic theocracy that rules them.
Right. If you watch cable news, we tend to view Iran as this monolithic nation of religious zealots who all hate the West. But Macgregor, looking at demographic data, estimates that over 50% of the Iranian population is actually largely disinterested in the strict dictates of Islam.
50%, that's a huge number.
Yeah. He points out a historical fact that often gets ignored in political rhetoric. Islam was originally an Arab import to the region. It is not organic to ancient Persian culture. He notes that today, many mosques in Iran are largely empty during services, and societal mores and dress codes have significantly relaxed behind closed doors.
And this cultural context leads to a truly tragic anecdote he shares, which perfectly illustrates the catastrophic failure of relying on bombs for regime change. He mentions a contact of his, an analyst who visits Iran frequently. This contact showed Macgregor a map of the capital city, Tehran.
On this map, there were red pencil circles drawn around specific, affluent, upper and middle-class neighborhoods.
And the contact explained to Macgregor that these specific red-circled neighborhoods were filled with highly educated, cosmopolitan people. These people were fierce Iranian nationalists, They deeply hated the restrictive theocracy. They loved their country. They believed in the ancient legacy of Persia, and they wanted peaceful, internal, democratic change.
They were the exact, perfect demographic the West constantly hopes will lead a revolution.
Exactly. But then the contact delivered a devastating punchline. He pointed to the red circles and told Macgregor they are now largely dead.
Wait, really? Dead?
Yes. Why were they dead? Because, according to the contact, Western bombs, specifically U.S. and Israeli strikes aimed at nearby infrastructure or leadership targets over the years, ended up leveling those specific affluent neighborhoods. Macgregor calls the strategy utterly stupid. By indiscriminately bombing the country, we physically eradicated the very internal secular resistance we constantly claim we want to support.
That's incredibly grim. And what is the broader psychological result of that bombing campaign on the survivors? Absolute unbreakable cohesion. Macgregor compares this psychological reaction to the 1990s NATO bombing of Serbia during the Kosovo crisis.
Okay, another historical comparison.
The explicitly stated policy goal in Washington at the time was to bomb the country until the people ousted Slobodan Milosevic from power. But what actually happened on the ground, when a foreign power drops bombs on your city, the people unite behind their leader, no matter how much they might domestically despise him.
Because it becomes about survival.
Exactly. The bombing didn't oust Milosevic, it entrenched him. He was only ousted a year after the bombing stopped, by internal, organic political forces.
The mechanism of human nature is incredibly consistent in this regard. When a foreign military attacks your homeland, your domestic political grievances instantly evaporate and primal survival and nationalism take over. Macgregor argues that because of the constant threat of Western attack, the Iranian population is now more unified and cohesive against external threats than it has ever been in its modern history.
And despite what Western media narratives might constantly claim about their impending collapse, they are certainly not running out of weapons to defend themselves.
Not at all. Macgregor cites intelligence estimates indicating that Iran still has an arsenal of 15,000 to 20,000 sophisticated missiles ready to fire.
That's a massive stockpile.
And more importantly, they aren't relying on imports. They have the indigenous industrial capacity to manufacture 50 to 100 new precision missiles every single month in those deep underground facilities we discussed earlier, completely safe from airstrikes. Add to that an estimated 45,000 remaining drones. The comforting Western narrative that an Iranian military collapse is imminent is, in his view, a dangerous fantasy.
He also points to a massive cultural blind spot in America that drives these bad decisions. He argues that Americans mistakenly believe that everyone in the world is deep down exactly the same as us, that everyone is just a frustrated Western consumer waiting to be liberated so they can buy blue jeans and iPhones.
Right, the mirror imaging problem.
He uses a chilling domestic example to prove how identity actually works. Major Needle Hassan, the U.S. Army psychiatrist who committed the Fort Hood shooting, Hassan was born in the United States. He was an American citizen, an officer, a medical professional. He had every advantage of the Western system. But Macgregor says Hassan woke up one day, looked in the mirror, realized he identified primarily, deeply as a Muslim Arab rather than an American soldier, and then he began shooting his colleagues. Macgregor's point isn't about religion. His point is that culture, ethnicity, and deep-seated historical identity matter immensely, and the U.S. ignores this reality at its own peril when formulating foreign policy.
To put an analogy to this regime change strategy,
Yeah.
think about trying to fix a delicate, highly complicated, centuries-old antique watch. The U.S. intelligence community looks at the watch running slow, representing the theocratic government in Iran, and decides the best, most efficient tool to fix it is a 10-pound sledgehammer.
You smash the watch.
Right. You don't fix the time. You just crush all the delicate internal gears, the local nationalist resistance, the organic civil society that might have eventually, slowly, made the watch run right on its own.
And that leads to a profound question about the competence of our institutions. If any regular person on the street can understand the basic human psychology that bombing a country unites its people against you, why does a multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus keep repeating the exact same strategic mistake they made with Milosevic in the 90s?
It's baffling. Is it just arrogance?
In intelligence circles, it comes down to a phenomenon called mirror imaging. It's the fatal flaw of assuming that adversaries or other nations share American cultural priorities, American risk assessments, and will react the way we think we would react in a vacuum. But when you threaten a proud 2,700-year-old civilization like Persia, their ancestral nationalism will always, always trump their temporary domestic political grievances.
Okay, so let's summarize the incredibly bleak picture we have painted so far. According to Macgregor's analytical framework, the diplomatic strategy is a theater designed to mask a donor trap. The military doctrine of relying on air power is a historical delusion that ignores logistics. The actual physical battlefield is a 1,200-kilometer technological killing zone we cannot safely penetrate. And our attempts at regime change via kinetic strikes are just murdering our potential allies and unifying the enemy population against us.
It's a disaster on every level.
If literally every single component of this system is broken, why does the machine just keep grinding forward? Why don't we stop?
To answer that, we have to follow the money. And that brings us to the structural root of the problem: the military-industrial complex and the economics of a fading empire.
Macgregor argues that the U.S. military-industrial complex requires perpetual motion. It's a beast that cannot stop eating. And he makes a really interesting, depressing point about the broader U.S. economy. He notes that over the last 40 years, much of our standard blue-collar manufacturing making televisions, automobiles, consumer goods was exported to China, Vietnam, and Mexico. We hollowed out our industrial base. But military manufacturing, making missiles, jets, and tanks, that remained onshore. Because of that, the defense industry has effectively become a massive, unacknowledged domestic jobs program.
Ah, I see. He gets very geographically specific about how this traps politicians. Defense spending is almost never dictated by what the military actually needs for national security or future readiness. It is dictated by the geographic locations of bases, assembly plants, and parts manufacturers.
He names states like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York.
Right. The defense budget goes to Capitol Hill, and Congress is completely hostage to this industry. A representative literally cannot vote to stop building a redundant, unnecessary missile system if the factory making the guidance chips for that missile is the single largest employer in their voting district. It would be political suicide.
It's less like a hamster wheel and more like a biological parasite that has completely taken over the host's nervous system. The parasite, the defense industry, needs to keep moving, consuming tax dollars and generating conflicts to survive. And it forces the host, the U.S. economy and Congress, to walk into incredibly dangerous geopolitical situations just to keep feeding it. It doesn't actually win wars or create global peace. Its only function is to keep millions of Americans employed.
And this desperate reliance on militarism to prop up the domestic economy bleeds into how the United States treats its own allies, which leads to Macgregor's incredibly scathing critique of NATO. He compares the modern United States relationship with Europe to how the ancient Roman Empire treated the Greeks.
This was a wild historical comparison. Walk us through how he frames this.
Well, historically, the Romans deeply admired Greek civilization. They loved their architecture, their philosophy, their language. It's very similar to how modern Americans view Europe as the romantic fountainhead of Western civilization and culture. But eventually, as Rome grew into an empire, the Romans got tired of the Greek city-states constantly squabbling and fighting amongst themselves. So, the Romans didn't negotiate. They sent the legions, ruthlessly put down the rebellions, and essentially dictated terms. They said, "Shut up. You are now a vassal state of our empire. You will provide us with auxiliary legions for our wars, and you will do exactly what Rome says."
And Macgregor says that imperial subjugation is exactly how Washington treats modern Europe through NATO today. We don't treat them as sovereign equals. We demand they subjugate their own economic and security interests to ours.
In fact, Macgregor goes so far as to say the U.S. should have completely dissolved NATO and left Europe in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, forcing European nations to step up and handle their own defense organically.
He argues that European nations should actually be incredibly grateful that Donald Trump is currently using harsh rhetoric, threatening to push them away and perhaps even leave NATO. Macgregor sees Trump's hostility toward NATO as a blessing in disguise for Europe.
Because they shouldn't get involved.
Exactly, because the Europeans absolutely should not, in his vivid words, impale themselves on the Strait of Hormuz by getting dragged into an American-led war in the Middle East that fundamentally does not serve their energy or security interests.
So we have a defense industry holding the U.S. Congress hostage. We have an empire treating its oldest allies like disposable vassals. But what about the president himself? If Trump is trapped in this machine, how does it end for him?
Macgregor makes a stunning, highly specific political prediction here about Trump's future if this Middle Eastern situation goes sideways. He predicts that if Trump pushes back too hard, he won't be impeached by a hostile Congress. Instead, he could face removal via the 25th Amendment, initiated by his own hand-picked cabinet.
This is a remarkably dark and controversial claim. Let's look at the mechanics of why he thinks that is a realistic scenario.
Because, according to Macgregor, Trump's cabinet is intentionally filled with what he terms Israel firsters. He alleges that these officials have essentially signed an unspoken oath of loyalty to those interests above all else.
And he believes that if the mega donors we talked about earlier, the ones who allegedly bought the White House, decide that Trump has become a volatile liability rather than a useful asset, they won't bother with an election.
No, they'll just bypass it.
They will simply instruct the cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment, declaring the president unfit for duty, thereby removing him and bypassing the lengthy, public, and messy impeachment process entirely.
It is a profoundly cynical vision of a government completely captured by unelected, unaccountable financial interests. If we synthesize Macgregor's overarching worldview from this entire interview, he is vividly describing an empire in late-stage terminal decay.
The United States is desperately projecting a military power it no longer physically possesses against complex enemies it fundamentally misunderstands, in order to protect a domestic manufacturing industry it can't afford to lose, all while aggressively alienating the very allies it refuses to treat as equals.
And that leads to a really difficult structural question for anyone listening to this analysis. If U.S. defense spending is effectively just a massive domestic stimulus package, holding up the working-class economy in key swing states, can America ever truly adopt a peaceful, restrained foreign policy without intentionally destroying its own economy from the inside out?
That is the ultimate inescapable trap. It's much deeper and much more dangerous than just one president's rhetoric or one administration's policy.
Exactly. It's systemic. So let's bring this massive journey to a close. We've taken you through the entirety of Douglas Macgregor's controversial framework today. We started by looking at the trap of donor politics and the danger of applying real estate bankruptcy tactics to nuclear diplomacy.
We looked over the sheer economic cliff of the petrodollar and how de-dollarization threatens the U.S. standard of living. We examined the historical delusion of relying solely on air power, comparing it to the logistical blunders of World War II, and we explored the tragic, sledgehammer-like misunderstanding of Iranian nationalism.
And we tied it all together by exploring the structural decay of the military-industrial complex that keeps this whole blind machine moving inexorably forward.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, drawing on Macgregor's concluding remarks from his interview. He argues that the phrase America first, which is thrown around constantly in politics, has been entirely hijacked.
How so?
He believes it should not mean building a massive military to bomb the rest of the world into submission to maintain an artificial economic hegemony. He says true America First policy should mean respecting the natural order of the world, respecting that Russians are Russian first, Iranians are Iranian first, and the Dutch are Dutch first.
He claims that the relative peace of the post-World War II era largely worked because borders were eventually recognized in a way that respected organic national and tribal identities.
But he argues that the modern West, driven by a universalist interventionist ideology, now actively demonizes any organic manifestation of nationalism or defense of local national culture as inherently evil and backward.
And so, the final question for you to mull over something that builds on Macgregor's view, but pushes it a step further into the future. If true, lasting geopolitical peace actually requires us to stop trying to force our own cultural values, our economic systems, and our democratic structures onto the rest of the globe.
If it requires the United States to physically retreat behind its own borders and mind its own business, is America culturally, economically, and psychologically prepared to accept a world where it is no longer the main character?
It's a profound question about national ego. Can a superpower voluntarily step down?
It really is the defining question of our era. At the beginning of this deep dive, we talked about looking at a map of the world. We want it to be like an X-ray. We want the clean lines, the clear diagnoses, the obvious heroic solutions.
But the reality is muddy.
The reality is muddy. The reality is 1,200-kilometer autonomous killing zones, fragile economies resting on a single desert pipeline, artificial borders drawn by empires in a single afternoon, and life-or-death decisions driven by campaign donors rather than strategic logic.
The X-ray machine is broken. And the sooner we realize that the old tools don't work, the sooner we can start actually navigating the mud.
Thank you for taking this deep dive into the material with us today. Keep questioning the narrative, keep looking past the clean lines on the map, and we'll see you next time.